I know for sure, been down this road before, a road that never seemed to end.
I know for sure, I've seen it all before.
I've seen
What
it
goes
all
around
before.
is coming round again.
What goes around is coming round again. I know for sure, been down this road before. Been down this road before.
Down this road. Some old folks tell the story about the way things used to be. It sounded like they were describing the world today. So sad to say, I know for sure. Been down this road before, the same old story, just a different day. I know for sure, been down this road before, been down this road before. I heard somebody say that they don't like the way some people look or pray. Stand your ground, ask questions later. Okay to shoot them down, long as they're black or brown. We need a change today to find a better way. I know for sure, been down this road before. A road that never seems to end. I know for sure, I've seen it all before. What goes around is coming around again. I know for sure, been down this road before. Been down this road before. I know for sure that only love can cure, as history repeats itself. And then I know for sure it's time to close the door. And if not now, then who knows where or when? I know for sure, been down this road before. Been down this road before. Been down this road before. Down this road before. Been down this road before. Been down this road before.
Excellent. I'm so glad you all are here as we close out Black History Month. We are among friends. Hold on. Sorry. As we close out Black History Month, and I'm just really glad that you all have joined us. And it is my delight, absolute delight, to welcome Dr. Renee K. Harrison. So let me just spotlight her for a moment. Hi, Renee. Renee Harrison is an associate professor of African American and U.S. religious history at Howard University. She joined the School of Divinity faculty in the fall of 2010. Dr. Harrison's research interests include an interdisciplinary and interfaith approach to African American religious history and culture, early American religious history, Black feminist, womanist thought, aesthetic theory, and the arts, phenomenology, and rituals of healing and resistance. Harrison is the recipient of awards, grants, and fellowships. She co-facilitated with Dean Yolanda Pierce the Community, Spirituality, and the Arts series at Howard University School of Divinity. Her latest artistic work is called A Requiem for Black Bodies, created, produced, and directed by Dr. Renee, and we're going to talk more about that later. It's a contemporary urban production in remembrance of Black people traumatized by racism and violence in the United States. The Requiem aims to help participants sit with historical and ongoing trauma inflicted upon Black people in the US and move to a state of reflection, healing, and action through imagery, music, spoken word, dance, meditation, and ritual. And it's in 4 parts: the lament, the silence, the healing, and the activism. Dr. Harrison earned her BA from California State University, Northridge, her Master of Divinity and Master of Arts in Religious Education with honors, don't get it twisted, from the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta, Georgia, and a PhD in religion with an interdisciplinary concentration in history, philosophy, feminist, womanist thought, and African American studies from Emory University. So I feel like a complete slacker in her presence. She is the author of Enslaved Women and the Art of Resistance in Antebellum America, engaged teaching in theology and religion, co-author with Dr. Janine Knight, University of Virginia Press. And Harrison's most recent publication is what she's here to talk to us about tonight, in addition to the Requiem, is Black Hands, White House, Slave Labor and the Making of America. This documents and appraises the role enslaved women, men, and children played in building the U.S. and its physical and fiscal infrastructure. The work highlights the material commodities produced by enslaved communities during the transatlantic slave trade. These commodities, namely cotton, tobacco, and sugar, enriched European and U.S. economies, contributing to the material and monetary wealth of the nation's founders and other early European immigrants and their descendants. And it bolstered the wealth of present-day companies founded during the American slave era. Her bio is much longer than this, but Dr. Renee is a native of Los Angeles, California. She's a retired 11-year veteran of the LAPD and a former executive director at A Leap of Faith Productions, a nonprofit community-based theater group. Most introductions will start with those list of accolades, but I want to just sort of turn it around a little bit because, you know, we tend to in our lives think that we are our educational achievements. We are our what we've authored. We are what we do for a living. And I want to introduce Dr. Renee as a deeply spirited woman. I want to say that she's delightful, she's funny, she's dedicated human being who centers herself in her work in the histories of her people. She's a scholar, yes, but also an artist and an activist, a creative and an intellectual, a rare mix of, you know, left and right brain, a spirit-filled human being who is authentically herself with no apologies or excuses. She is living into her true calling as an author, a creator, a wife, a friend, a spiritual being, and a child of God. So welcome this beautiful woman of God. Put up an emoji who I'm proud to call friend. Welcome, Dr. Renee.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
And we're excited to have you here. I really am just grateful to be in conversation with you on this last day of Black History Month, because, you know, this is what they give us, the shortest month of the year to celebrate our accomplishments and achievements. And we know that your life work is dedicated to highlighting and centering the work of African descendant people. And it's important that we be here and that we continue this conversation. So the book, Black Hands, White House, Slave Labor and the Making of America. And I just want to talk to you a little bit about let's start with this question. Why did you write the book? Tell us the story of how the book came to be.
Wow, that's a loaded question. So can I do this before I start
You can do
talking?
anything you want to
And
do.
I do hope this is engaging with everyone present. I'm not sure how many of you have been a part of Sacred Congress conversations. So in some sense, I don't want to repeat anything I've already said. I'm one of those presenters where repeat performance. I always think every time we utter a word, and the word became flesh, and the word became flesh, and the power and pneuma of the word, that it's always creating and recreating itself as we speak it. And so I always think about those moments where just the word, right, can cause someone to do um, some deep reflective work on their own journeys, on their own lives, on their own inaction and activism, right? And how that kind of shapes and plays itself out over time. One word can move us into a different direction, right? And so I think about the power of words. So that's why I work hard not to repeat something I've already said at another session, right? Because the word became flesh. So that in the space, in this new space that we are all creating together right now, gives us the opportunity to reimagine and live into the word that became flesh. So it's my hope that something I say, I mean, I was thinking when I was on Sacred Conversations, and Chris, you were there, I didn't know you, and you DM me and said, hey, can I have a conversation with you? And that's what keeps happening, right? Someone hears something I've said that has resonated with their own work, and then they take it, call me up, and then it just starts this chain reaction. And it's not the power of me. I want to meet that person you just introduced. Because at 62, I'm tired. That person, that was the me in my 20s and 30s and 40s. But at 62, I'm ready to go to bed. So in many ways, yeah, I have to hear myself spoken back, not the accolades, but myself spoken back. So that word becomes fresh. And I remember why I am here. Because some days I'm tired and I don't want to be here. And so I listened to just in that moment with the videos, how they revived me just in those two videos.
Mm-hmm.
They ministered to me to provide something today. So, and that's how the book in a sense came to be. I finished Emory years ago, and I remember sitting in my doctoral seminar, and they were all, young people talking about where they want to go and what they want to do, where they want to teach, and how big their ego is based upon the school. I want to go to Harvard. I want to go, yeah. And I kept saying, I want to go where Black people are. Um, I did, because I realized when I was sitting in the history classes, the white students knew more about my history than I knew. And I was like, I'll be damned, we're not gonna do that. That's not gonna be a repetitive cycle for me. So I stayed up through the night reading, just constantly, um, wanting to know more about the countries that were involved in the slave trade.
Mm.
And so I've always had this kind of deep connection with the ancestral well, right? That I come not just on the shoulders, but through the waters,
Mm.
on the waters of those that have created space for all of us. And so when I speak, when the word is flesh, I'm speaking because they were here. And, I ended up at a small school in Ohio. I always wanted to go to Howard University, but I ended up at a small school in Ohio. I mean, when I tell you a small school in Ohio, it was a one room building. I mean, a 5-room building, Payne Theological Seminary. And I thought, I'm never gonna get out of here. I'm not gonna ever get out of here. And people kept saying, you're not gonna get out of here. You're stuck. And it was within 2 years, Howard called. And I
Wow.
really want to go to the history department. I did not want to go to the School of Religion, but I took it. And I see now the value of that, because where these students are so inundated in the Christian story that comes from a Eurocentric Christian story,
Yes.
no matter how much we blacken it, their worship and theology is rooted in a very European understanding and practice of the faith. And so when I got to Howard, I would walk along the mall as a way to kind of, you know, breathe out the week at school. And so I'd walk along the mall and I kept saying, well, this is the nation capital. They don't have anything on the mall about what Black people did. I mean, like, where is it? What Black people created and their role in the creation of this country. And I used to always take this young, he was 13 at the time, Christopher Hobson. I would take him with me. And he kept saying, well, Renee, why don't you just write about it? And so that really started the impetus. A 13-year-old, a little child shall lead them.
Exactly.
A 13-year-old telling me, stop whining and write. And I started researching, and I spent a lot of time at the Holocaust Museum because the lines would be so long. And I thought, oh, Americans are like, they're fascinated about the atrocities against Jewish people, and they should be. But I mean, you know, they were lined up. And I was thinking to myself, where's the line about what America has done to its own people?
Right.
It would never register to me. Why is this history more important than the very history we are in and still in the 21st century? And so I started writing about the Holocaust initially. And it took me to the Museum to the Murdered Jews of Berlin. And I spent some time researching Germany. And then I spent some time with Germans' decision at that museum to tell the story of what they have done during the Holocaust. It's not perfect, but at least they were taking some sense of onus. And I began to ask the question, how is America owning its crimes?
Right.
And that's how the book came into being.
So that's excellent. So you talk about, well, I love the little child shall lead them, you know, that it was just the voice of a 13-year-old boy that said, you know, you have to write it. You have to write it. So, but you mentioned, you know, that you did study of the countries that had been involved in the transatlantic slave trade. And I know in your book that you indicated that you visited those countries. So talk to us a little bit about some of the countries involved in the transatlantic slave trade and give us a few examples of what you found there by way of monuments. You know, were there monuments? Are there, do any other countries besides America have monuments to the enslaved labor that contributed to their wealth?
So it was important to me, yes and no. So let me answer in that way. It was important to me to go to the capital cities of each country. So we're talking about Portugal and Spain, who were primarily the forerunners in the transatlantic slave trade. France, Great Britain, Netherlands, and Denmark, and other countries were involved, but those were the 6 countries that really had their hand in the slave trade. And so I decided to go to the capital cities because I'm here in the United States. It's not enough that Tennessee and Cincinnati and other cities have monuments to slavery. What about the nation's capital, the seat of the nation's government, the seat of power? And so there's nothing on the mall. I had to always say that because when people say, well, there are monuments in the US to slavery, there are monuments in DC. No, but there's nothing, the epicenter of the nation's capital, nothing. And so at the time that I started this, the museum had not been erected, but I'm not talking also, I have to keep emphasizing, I'm not talking about a museum where we archive, you know, I'm talking about this idea that America is built on this premise of glorifying, venerating their own ancestors in statues. And in awe of them, they travel to the nation's capital to
in droves
to take in the beauty of what their ancestors have created, right? And they'll say, well, we don't venerate ancestors. Yes, you do. They all over the mall. And
well,
so
their ancestors didn't even create it. So let's just
yeah, well, yeah, no, but I'm just saying that
yes, yes.
idea that
Yes,
people will say, well, why monuments? Why? That's what America glorifies, right?
right,
And we go to all these other countries, that's what you see in the epicenter of their capital are these monuments. And so I then wanted to know, okay, if I'm in France, the capital city of France, what's there? If I'm in Portugal, capital city of Portugal, what's there? If I go to Spain, capital city, what's there? So I went to Madrid, I went to Lisbon, I went to all these capital cities, and France was one of the locations that had a monument erected. And they not only had a monument erected in the capital city, but Nantes, they had the major port by which slave trade was taking place. They have this unbelievable, I mean, it's just almost like a half a mile monument. It's just unbelievable. But I couldn't find the same, um, and let me say this, erected by or sponsored by the government. So I'm not talking about what individuals have done. I'm talking about what the government of these countries have decided to say about their ownership in the atrocity. And so there were only, if I can recall, I know it was France, it was one other location, it's just not coming to me right now. There were the only two. Britain had nothing. I know Britain, I went there several times, but
right,
they had nothing. And so I thought, what is this, right? How do
right,
you tell a story and miss the major story that helped gain your capital?
right.
Not capital as in a physical structure, but I'm talking about as in a monetary,
Mhm.
that helped to sustain your economy. Like, how is it that you have nothing to talk about that work, the work of Black hands? And so it fired me up even more to really want to write about the absence of standalone monuments in the epicenter of these cities where the government, the seat of government, is housed. Why aren't there any monuments there?
Excellent. So tell me, like in DC, what monuments were erected or built by enslaved labor?
So I think you're going to get me to the Charlotte Scott conversation,
I am,
right?
but yeah, I am, but I want to, so because many people just don't know, like
Yeah.
specifically
So
what monuments were erected by enslaved.
so if you're talking about monuments for Black people, none.
Right,
If you're talking about monuments for the enslaver,
right.
several,
Okay.
right?
So, right.
And so part of that is now I'm going to hesitate to say this,
Hmm.
especially because you're recording. I'm hesitant to say this because some argue that in some of my research, some argue that slave laborers did not have any hand in the actions of some of the monuments, and some argue that they did, like the Washington Monument, right?
Hmm.
So there, and then what we do know is that these historical landmarks that we consider monuments, the US Capitol, the White House, the Treasury, the building, there's no way to um, deny the involvement of their labors in erecting these institutions, these monuments, because we have receipts,
Right,
right? The
right,
owners were paid for the work of their enslaved labor. So we have receipts that says, okay, when the Capitol was built, a particular owner received a certain amount of money for the work of his particular enslaved person. So that's why they can't make that argument. But there's an argument that exists saying that the Jefferson Memorial, I mean, well, let me not say this, the Washington Memorial and other memorials that were built prior to the Civil War, and those that were erected after the Civil War when Black people were free but still working as sharecroppers, which is another form of slavery, I argue, right? We tend to think of slavery being without chains, but it continues and perpetuates itself. So Black people did have their hand in building those monuments and others.
right.
The research in terms of the factual knowledge of that gets disputed a lot. So I hesitate to answer a
I understand.
particular memorial, but I can talk about the structures themselves.
So in your book, you talk a lot about cultural amnesia. So what do you think accounts for America's insistence that the true history of this nation is obliterated and obliterated from the annals of history? What accounts for that in your
Yeah.
book?
Um, so part of it comes from who's telling the story.
Right.
and what story they're seeking to tell, and why are they seeking to tell that story. And if the story is about the glorification of the victor, you're going to have cultural amnesia about how the victor dehumanized and obliterated millions of people. That story is not going to be, if you're a victor, you don't want to tell the story of what you've done in harm to another.
Right.
So the cultural amnesia comes, and I call this selective cultural amnesia. It's not, I'm choosing to omit this part of the story because in telling that part of the story, I have to not only take ownership of what I participated in, but I have to take ownership of my evil.
Mm. And that's I mean, and that's a challenging, it's challenging for people to take ownership of their evil deeds. And, but, people of European descent whose ancestors might have engaged in this, well, that wasn't me. That wasn't, so how do we account for it today? Right. But that
Yeah.
wasn't.
Yeah, I love that. I always smile at that statement, right?
Right.
Right. And I'm trying to think if it was something, and I know someone on this Zoom, there's 17 of us,
Right.
have heard this story where the woman tells the story. God, I'm trying to think. It's in mm, it's in not Michelle Alexander's work.
Cast,
Yeah,
Isabel Wilkerson. Mm-hmm.
yeah. So it's in her work where she talks about the houses, right? Anyone
Yes,
remember that
yes,
story?
yes, yes.
Retell that story because I don't always botch
No,
it
the
up.
story is,
Tell it.
you buy a house and you find out that the foundation is rotten and you still have to get the house fixed. You still have to take responsibility for the house.
Yeah,
Right.
the moment you buy that house, the history of the house is yours.
Right.
Right? And you take ownership of how that house needs care for, right? The areas of the house that need fixing, you fix it. And so
Exactly.
I think this idea that, I just had this conversation with my students just the other day, right? Um, there has to be some level of intentional divestment
Mm.
in order to at least say I'm washing my hands or I'm taking responsibility and washing my hands of the sins of the past. Because if I'm benefiting from it, I'm still participating.
Right. But
Right?
people don't want to admit that they're benefiting from it. They want to think that, that everything they've gotten on their own, independent of their ancestry or what their parents left them or what their grandparents entrusted to them. They think that they've gotten there on their own.
Mm-hmm.
It's that notion of rugged individualism that keeps on perpetuating itself. That it is beyond, like it's me to like it's only me. Like I'm the only one that did this. The great I am got this. Does that make sense what I'm
Oh, it
saying?
makes perfect sense. And part of what I try to do in the book, I remember when Amanda passed her first congregational church. I mean, most people start the book, they don't finish it. It's a lot. It's a lot, it's not
It
nap
is a lot.
ministry. It's just not nap ministry. So I mean, and I'm not saying nap ministry, rest is resistance is problematic. I'm not saying that.
Right.
But it's not something that you can digest in one sitting. That's what I'm
Certainly
trying to
not.
say.
Right.
And so Amanda is one of those persons I know who I love. I mean,
Yes.
that is my sister, and we are very close. And so Amanda read that book from beginning to end. I mean, she read all of it, and she said, "You just go into so much detail." I was just getting like, "Oh my God, there's too much detail, just too much." And then she said, "I see the device, what you were doing." She
Mm-hmm.
said, "It took me to get to the end to realize what you were doing. You give us all this detail, down to how many nails
Mm.
George Washington used to build his barn." And she said, "It's just so much detail." But George Washington couldn't even remember the names of the people he enslaved.
Mm.
And so I work hard to overwhelm you with data.
Yeah.
This is what I also do. that data, in that data are human beings.
Yes.
And these human beings are inherited and passed down from family to family to family to family to family. Right? So much so you get what's happening in Georgetown, right? You get the descendants.
Right.
They're still making claims about Georgetown. They get passed down. And so all of these assets get passed down. And so in some ways, and I'm not saying everyone, because we have to admit what Bell Hooks talks about, that there are the poor whites among us, right? So we can't say that all white people inherited wealth, right?
Right.
But what we can say that there is a percentage of Americans that have lived off of the passing down of Black bodies over time. And
Yes.
the percentage of Americans, if the Black body was not passed down, the Black body was disenfranchised for their well-being.
Right.
They benefited from the passing down of Black bodies, and they've also benefited from the disenfranchisement of Black bodies.
Well, and this is also, I think, where cultural amnesia comes in, right? Because many people of European descent will never want to do the research to find out how they may have benefited from the passing down of Black bodies, for their benefit, right? So, people of African descent barely want to trace, their own ancestry to find out at what point in time in history were their people enslaved and who owned them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who owned their people. So, I mean, it's so painful, and I think that, yeah, cultural amnesia is convenient. It's convenient because to remember and to embrace it, or to at least acknowledge it, is just too painful and too difficult and too challenging. Yeah. And it brings up the whole issue of reparations. We have a woman who's here with us this evening, Dr. Phyllis Coachman, who is the executive minister at Safe Haven, who's deeply involved in the reparations movement for African descendants of American descendants of African slavery. And it's a very challenging, and you can see all the resistance currently in the political sphere, right? When you talk about, CRT, which, is a misnomer, of course, but when you see the resistance to teaching American children in schools about this history of enslavement, they don't want it taught because it's making people too, little Johnny will be too uncomfortable. And, so I just wanted to,
and this, can I just add this to what you're saying, Chris, because this notion it'll make Johnny too uncomfortable gets right at the heart of why Black bodies don't matter.
Right.
Because we live that uncomfortability and are still living that uncomfortability
every day.
And we're asked to suck it up.
Suck it up.
Why are they still dealing with something that happened? And I always tell my students, even when I was in doctoral studies, they're like, why are you writing? My own peers would say, why are you writing about slavery? I mean, like, that is such a dead subject. Okay, good luck. And so I've never given that up.
Right.
Right? Because what happened in the 15th century, in the 16th century, in the 17th century, in the 19th century, continued into the 20th and 21st
century. Exactly.
So you'll say to me, people will always say to me, why are you writing about Breonna Taylor in your book? And people thought I was doing that because it was popular, right?
Right.
You have Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, and George Floyd. Like, why are you writing about them, right? Are you just on the bandwagon? No, I'm tracing it. Like, I'm not shocked. I'm not shocked, right?
Right.
It does not shock me.
Yeah.
It is American.
It is American. It's probably the most American thing. It's like, so what about, you mentioned Charlotte Scott and her offering. Tell the story about the Lincoln Memorial and Charlotte Scott's offering.
Do you really want me to tell the story? I don't like telling that story. Do you really want me to tell that story?
Well, I want you to,
I'll tell it. I'll tell the edge of it, right? Because I have a tendency. Remember, I'm 62, so I should say that because there are people that are, my mother's 97. I have to admit, she's 97 with a better memory than me. Okay.
Oh,
So,
wow.
um,
Yeah, we've forgotten more
so
stuff.
yeah, no. So I don't want to make it a age thing. I just know that my body is not as, I just came from
I-
physical therapy and I know my mind and my body is not the same. So what I can say about Charlotte Scott, so this is kind of here's another research, and I always tell my students, I'm not the last word of anything, right? I'm just researching
Right,
just like anyone else, right?
right.
And part of the reason why I go through the archives, because I know the question is going to be, where are you getting your research
Where are
from?
you getting it right?
Like, so you take my book, it's thick, but 1/3 of it is footnotes because I
Right,
know who and what I'm dealing with. Right.
right,
So when you question, I'm like, well, in George Washington letter, he said it. I didn't say it. George Washington said it. So, I mean, I'm sorry, but your man, Abraham Lincoln, he
right,
said, like, I'm not making this stuff up and I'm not cherry picking.
right,
Right. I'm not taking something in isolation. It's a thought. It's an ethos, right? When Thomas Jefferson makes a claim about Black people and their intelligence, it's the claim he's been making for centuries, right? But we take that one sentence where he kind of abhorred slavery after he owned 600 people. But anyway, we kind of take this, right? So I'm saying this to say I'm going to put a pin in Charlotte Scott before I tell the story.
okay.
Some people feel the Charlotte Scott story is much like the Willie Lynch letter. It's just
Mm,
not real. It's just kind of something to appease white Americans to say Black people were grateful for Abraham Lincoln. So you
right,
create the story of this is always the Black woman. This Black woman that's worked hard gives her meager monies to
right,
support the monument, right? And then you use the Black soldiers who you don't respect anyway to kind of give this money. And so you kind of built this story because it's built around the premise of white paternalism,
yes,
right? So that's kind of what's been argued about her. I tend to take the story at face value. I do. Now, as a historian, I have to be careful to say that because we don't have any, well, I have not uncovered, because I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I
mhm,
have not uncovered any evidence of Charlotte Scott's own words.
okay.
I have the words of what others have said about
Said about her, right.
her.
Well, and
So
that
what
could be very
happens is,
self-serving.
yeah, so she's enslaved. She's born into slavery. And I think it's like, I mean, someone can look this up. It's like 1803 that she's born into slavery. And we know that slavery ended, I mean, technically.
Technically, right, well, it hasn't ended.
In
It's,
1867, right? So we
right,
know that for the majority of her life, into her adulthood, Charlotte Scott is an enslaved woman.
right,
So I want us to think about that. A Black woman who's born into slavery, who knows what hell she's been through other than just working her life to the bone, right? What other craziness she's had to experience in her lifetime. Charlotte Scott is freed, and then she works for her master. So she works in the home of her master as a free person, as a
and it's
servant,
really free, right,
right? Right. So, I don't
right,
know. I mean, that's why people say that doesn't make any sense. But I mean, I don't want to read into that story. I'm only going to tell you as the story tells itself.
okay,
So her enslaver is a prominent person at the time. And he's, in his drawing room with other prominent people, and they're talking about what Lincoln has done, and she's listening. And so she says, hey, well, I like to give, my meager earnings. Okay, I'm sorry, I should do this.
no, it's okay,
I have to laugh at this stuff.
right, right,
I'm like crazy. So, she says, I want to give just my meager earnings for a monument in honor what Mr. Lincoln has done for the Black people. So she gets $5. And that's the start of the Lincoln Memorial, well, Freedmen's Memorial
right,
in Washington, D.C. Now, I don't know if anyone's ever seen the memorial, but well, let me not get into how it turns out.
right,
So they're now deciding, wow, look at this. A Black woman gives her money, which kind of is the impetus of the Freedmen's Memorial. Let's kind of see if other Black people will contribute so that we know it's kind of the Freedmen's Memorial. It's the memorial that former slaves have decided to erect in honor of Mr. Lincoln.
Well,
So they go to they get the majority of their money from soldiers. So soldiers, after they're fighting in the war, they give a little of their earnings, and some of them, while they're fighting, they give their own earnings in honor of this memorial. So as the story goes, and I love to tell the story of the Freedmen's Bank, because that's a whole new different, the stealing of Black people's money.
Right.
But this story becomes important because now you have Black people who raised all this money for memorial to be erected, and they give it to Charlotte Scott's former owner and a company. I can't think of the name of the company, but it's a company, right? That he gives it to kind of sponsor the building of this monument. So Black people raise the money, but they have no say so as to the design or any other aspect of the monument. So,
well, it speaks to so many. I mean, there's so many interwoven themes in that story, right?
yeah, wait, but let me get this out, because this
Okay,
is
go ahead. Sorry.
this is the crux of this story, and I'm gonna finish with this,
That's
right?
okay. I'm sorry.
So they have a ceremony, and Frederick Douglass is the speaker, right? President comes, everybody's like, big old parade, huge parade to unveil this monument to President Lincoln that was built from the monies of former enslaved persons. And when they take the cloth off the monument, you have a kneeling Black man who's looking up to Lincoln as though he's saying, "Thank you, Master, for freeing me." That's the essence of the monument. You can just type it in your internet, Freedmen's Memorial. And Douglass is pissed off when he sees it, right? He's like, this is so crazy. So he actually pretty much says it in his speech. And Charlotte Scott apparently is among the crowd, but she's never referenced. She doesn't speak. But when you go to the monument, her name is erected at the bottom as the one who was the first to give her monies.
Well, wait, what does Douglass say? Say what Douglass says.
Oh, you want me to read it?
Yeah.
Well, I gotta find it, but if you want me to read part of it, can I just, for time's sake, can I just say, look it up, Douglass letter? I mean, Douglass.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I can find part of it. You want me?
Okay, but yeah, I mean, the book is so rich. It's got so much information.
Yeah, but if you type it in the internet, right? He basically says, it's a bunch of crap. I mean, he basically is so many.
He says, fellow citizens, I end as I began with congratulations. We've done a good work for our race today. In doing honor to the memory of our friend and liberator, we have been doing highest honors to ourselves and those who come after us. When now it shall be said that the colored man is soulless, that he has no appreciation of benefits or benefactors, when the foul reproach of ingratitude is hurled at us, and it is attempted to scourge us beyond the range of human brotherhood, we may calmly point to the monument we have this day erected to the memory of Abraham Lincoln. But that wasn't the piece.
No, that's not. Yeah, no, he goes. It's earlier. I had to find. Okay,
it's okay. It's okay. Don't worry about it. We can move on. But what I was thinking is, like, so many themes. So this image of Lincoln as being, the great liberator, quote unquote, right? But not knowing, all of the motivations. It speaks to how people of African descent were deprived of the real inside story of what was going on. It speaks to the notion of paternalism. It speaks to so many themes that continue to persist to this day, right? And how it has impacted people of African descent, particularly in terms of the way we view even our efforts, right? The way we don't interrogate and really get to the bottom of, the story, or we don't, and the way we've been deprived of education or
Mm.
even the ability, to research. When you speak in your book about how students have come up to you after class, after you teach, where did you find all this? Like, and almost implying that you made it up out of whole cloth.
Mhm.
And it's like, well, it's buried in the history, and
Mhm.
it's buried there. It's what it is. Um, so
It's
in your
it,
book, it speaks like the next question sort of I had was, I love the term, like the how what malevolence is whitewashed,
mhm,
and how it continues to be whitewashed,
mhm,
and how the story is retold, right? So even like, for example, I heard somebody recently say there's this whole new movement um, about the conviction of Derek Chauvin
mhm,
for the murder of George Floyd. And so now they're trying to resurrect, even though he's lost his appeals, they're trying to resurrect
mhm,
this notion of Floyd as a bad man,
mhm,
just a bad actor, a big scary guy, a
mhm,
bad actor, and
mhm,
retell, and the narrative is being respun. And we
mhm.
all know how, narratives get spun, which is why it's so important for us to tell our own stories, right? In
Yeah,
this, go ahead.
go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, no, go ahead.
No, it's important, and then you know, persons will say to me, "Do I feel monuments?" And I really don't. It's a question I don't like addressed to me, right? Because
Mhm.
I think a lot of times things are relative based upon what's happening in the moment, right? But I can answer this best as I am now. That's what I'll say. But people will say to me, "Do I feel monuments should be removed?" Right? Should some monuments, Confederate or otherwise, racist
Mhm.
monuments to be removed? And I always say, as a historian, no, let them stay. Let's just put alongside those monuments the other side of the story and let them sit there in creative tension, because once the monuments are removed, so does the eraser
Mm,
and the whitewashing of malevolence take place. We get
mm.
the opportunity to say it wasn't so when they're gone. But when they're there and we tell the fuller story, I mean, what would it be
Well, that's
like
the
on the
question.
Washington Monument if the names, and I put it in the book, right? I take the time to write the names of all of George Washington's, the first president, the general of the United States of America, who was intentional about a diamond shaped capital city between Maryland and Virginia being laid out by slave labor. Why not put the names etched in that tall Egyptian monument? Why not put the names of the slave laborers on the outside? Not the laborers of the monument, but the laborers that he enslaved on the
Right.
outside of that monument. Why not tell that version of the story? So there's a part of me that feels like all of this needs to remain. We need a fuller story, because what America does when those that are not given respect and access to tell the fuller story, then we start to say, no, I'm sorry, when they're given access to tell the fuller story, the first thing we want to do then is ban the story.
Right.
And at the same time, there has to be some intentionality to say, nope, we're going to push back against this. You want your monument, you keep your monument. But on that monument, we're going to tell the full story.
Right.
So and I'm gonna say this too about what we were saying. And I know I kind of went off point a little bit, but I'm saying this because I'm thinking about what you were saying earlier about selective amnesia.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's something here in terms of what we personally remember about our own life narratives, what we choose to remember and we choose not to remember, and why, and how that selective amnesia inside of ourselves with our own family plays out in the larger society. There's something beneficial by not remembering the pain.
Right.
So I'm going to put a pin there. And then I'm also going to add to the place of, it is clear to me that when America was founded, that this idea of an age of discovery and Europeans telling the story of expansion
Mhm.
and not telling the story of how that expansion took place was central to European identity.
Absolutely.
And that until we divest ourselves of this amnesia, until we accept that this intentionality took place to forge a new country, till we accept that, right? We will always play a role in selective amnesia. Does that make
Absolutely.
sense what I'm saying?
Yes, I
Yeah.
understand exactly
And
what you're
part
saying.
of the reason why I'm saying this, because I see it happening in my students. My students are overwhelmed. Overwhelmed.
Mhm.
S- Two sides of this. I presented at First Congregational Church, predominantly white church. First, one of the third question I received was, where did you get your information?
Right.
How, these sources. My students say this to me after every class. And so there's something in our psyche
Yes.
that says I have to resist what is in the founding documents.
Right.
So the information of what we've done is there. It's not, I heard you say about it being hidden. It's there. I didn't have to go deep. I just started
Right.
reading Washington's letters.
Well, I mean, and but what that speaks to is just how little history we know, how little history we're taught, and how we're taught to just, basically deal with many things at a very surface level, right? And people don't want to go down this rabbit hole because it makes them too uncomfortable. It's
Yeah.
again that notion of of fragility. I mean, that we cannot accept the truth. We don't want to embrace the truth. We don't want to really know the truth because there's too many other things swirling and swirling around us, and that we have to confront and deal with, and it's too painful.
And but I also say that same reality is how it plays out in our own lives with our
Yeah,
own families. It's all
absolutely.
there. I mean, it's just we play it out on a societal level, we play it out.
Oh,
So when we're daring about the white elephant in our homes, we'll be daring about the white elephant in society.
absolutely. Absolutely.
And let me say why I say this, because this goes to your last question, right?
Mhm.
We shape the narrative that soothes us, right?
Exactly.
Black people during the Reagan administration were crack addicts and hoes,
Right.
strawberries and otherwise. Excuse me, everyone. But today they have a substance abuse disorder.
Right. Because
Not black people,
right.
but Americans who are high on opium have a substance abuse disorder. See, it gets named, it gets whitewashed.
Exactly. It gets
And
whitewashed.
the black narrative is not only vandalized, but it's violent and it's
It's
ratchet.
dehumanizing and
It is
ratchet.
very much dehumanizing. And
Exactly.
that's how we shape the story. That's how we've always shaped the story. And we have to ask ourselves where the story is paternalistic, where the story soothes, where the story is whitewashed, what's the story behind that story?
Right. Well, and that's the problem. I mean, I think that's where most people don't want to go. They don't want to go to the story behind the story, right? Because, of the pain of it, but also because, if you do that, if you take a narrative and you say, okay, this is your narrative, and then you dig behind that narrative and you start to reveal the deeply,
Mhm.
embedded racist and white supremacist ideology behind that narrative, and the reasons why in a racialized capitalistic society that narrative is suiting the ends of the people in power, then you're labeled a heretic, you're labeled a troublemaker, you're labeled this and that, and then that becomes inconvenient, and then they start trying to strip you of stuff, right?
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
I mean, I've got direct experience with that. But so I want to stop at this point just for a second to see if anybody in the, here on the Zoom has any questions they want to put in the chat, or you want to raise your hand and ask at this point, because I want to go into the more creative work. I was going to ask you a question about Breonna Taylor, but I will, forego that because we're almost at 8 o'clock and I want to have you for a little while longer, but
Oh, wow.
um,
Let
I,
me just ask a question, and I don't know, it's not a question, but as you were going through
where are you?
Abraham Lincoln and the intentionality behind these monuments, I grew up in Harlem's Lincoln Projects.
Mm,
Abraham, and it just hit me today, and I'm just going to share the screen. They could have put a monument up like what looks like the Lincoln Memorial in the projects.
mhm.
I grew up with this image every day of my life. This is where I grew up.
Oh my
Right?
gosh. Wow.
Lincoln houses. We
Wow.
played on this statue, climbed
Wow.
it,
Wow.
did all kinds of things on this statue, and how this whatever the narrative that I
Mm,
gleaned from that from a child, along with the stories of our founding fathers and Abraham Lincoln freeing the slaves, and the little bit of history you got when when I was in high school, you had ninth grade Eastern civilization, 10th grade Western civilization, and Western civilization would take you all the way up until like around Christmas time, you were in the American Revolution. And and the next month we were in the Civil War. But it didn't even cover
mhm.
enslavement. But just listening to you, this is the first time it hit me.
Mm,
This is the image that
wow.
I saw every single day of my life.
Wow. I want to look at, is there a name of that one? I actually want to look into that one. I've
Well, I mean,
never,
let's see the images like, this kind, benevolent
yeah,
Abraham
it's
Lincoln
just,
with a black child at his knee, you know, okay.
and
White
look,
It's
and look
called
where
Lincoln and Child.
Lincoln
Lincoln
and
and
child.
Child. And look
It-
at where it's erected. See, that's
Uh-huh.
what we have to. It's not only the displayment, but also the placement. It's
Yeah,
not only what they display, but where they place it. And that's what we have to really think about, right?
right, right.
And then when what you're saying, Ruby, what that does to you as a child, that keeps getting reinforced. And look at the size of Lincoln and look at the size of the child.
Yes, yes,
Look how the child is dressed and how Lincoln is dressed. And
right,
and it's always this thing where they're looking up to Lincoln.
right,
When you go into the Washington, when you go to the Lincoln Memorial on the National Mall, you have to look up to Lincoln.
right. Well, that's intentional, right?
But these kind of things call out such sadness that you didn't even know was there.
Yeah.
You didn't
Mhm.
know it was there.
So anybody else have any questions? Any thoughts or comments at this juncture? So I mean, I really appreciate your scholarship and I
All right,
appreciate.
Susan Switzer has her
Oh,
hand.
Susan, go ahead, Susan. Wait, where are you?
Hi, Dr. Harrison.
Hi, Susan. How are you doing?
I'm well. It's really nice to see you. My question, your comments are incredible tonight. I'm particularly interested in your comments about you mentioned Germany is beginning to own or has owned their complicity, their the Holocaust, and owning it and speaking it and not forgetting it. It's not perfect, you said. And then you also talked about the Dutch, the Denmark, the English, the Portuguese, the British. I come from Dutch heritage. My grandmothers were, one of my grandmothers was from the Dutch Reformed Church. I was in Ghana in December and January and went to some of the slave castles, which I have a problem with the language, the dungeons. And above the dungeons was the Dutch church. And if you look at the architecture, you will see in Dutch the name of the Dutch Reformed Church. So I'm beginning to just wanting to trace further that Dutch Reform connection. So I guess my question to you is, what other countries besides Germany are the Dutch, the Portuguese, or the British
Mhm.
owning? How are they owning this? And
Yeah.
then, yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. And so when I came to the close of my research, at the time it was only France, and I just cannot think of the other country because I can see the monument. I just can't think of where It was, and for some reason, I don't know why I'm thinking the Netherlands, but
Was it
it's
was it
it's
It is
Portugal?
the
It wasn't
Netherlands, right?
Portugal?
it wasn't it might have been the Netherlands because it's the Netherlands.
Yeah.
So those were the two countries that had monuments erected to slave labor, and the government was involved in the process of those monuments. But Britain does not have, I know for sure Britain does not have one in London. So I'm not talking about on the offskirts, right? In London. And Portugal does not have one, right? I purposely took a tour twice of Lisbon because I said, I know there has to be something here. But
Right.
no, Christopher Columbus is sitting larger than large in Spain and London. So it was France and the Netherlands. Those
Wow.
were at the time of my research. Now, I'm sure that was in 2001, right? Other countries
Right.
might have come on board since then. And when I want to keep emphasizing when I say countries involved in the erection of monuments, I'm talking about the government
Right.
being involved in the funding or some aspect of the erection of these monuments. I'm not talking about private citizens, but it was the Netherlands and France
France.
Okay.
who had substantial monuments. It's not, it was the Netherlands, now that I think about it, because I can see myself now back in Amsterdam. So yeah, it's the one in Netherlands is in the center of a park.
Hmm.
It's long. I mean, it's not, just some small statue, right? It literally reinterprets the trade itself
Wow.
from chains and
Wow. Okay.
So
Are you saying then that these, like the Netherlands, and Germany in particular, those are two places where we could, as Americans, as US citizens, take those models to be a way to reframe the narratives here? Is that correct?
yes, and that's part of what and France. That's
Okay.
part of what I'm arguing in the book.
Okay, great.
If you don't want to, because Americans have an issue with the Holocaust, and right, so so if you don't want to lay claim to how Britain has done it, then join your people, right? I'm not saying you, Susan, I'm saying in general, join
Right.
your people that were involved in the transatlantic slave trade, like France and Netherlands, right? They have
Yeah.
done models.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful.
Yeah. And so let me just say this too about the Dutch Reformed Church. The part of my work looks at the church involvement in the erection of these, and I have an issue with the word castle too as well, but in the erection of these castles, right? And so my students, when I show them these castles, the church is right there, the cross and everything. And so I take them right to the Pope's, Dom Diversi,
Right.
Roman Pontifex, all these documents that said, take the land, take the people, and Christianize them.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I have my students struggle with the fact that when Malcolm says Christianity is a white man's religion, where is he getting that from? Right? It's right there in the narratives, right? Because you can't say that, I'm always arguing. I'm gonna say this real quick and I'm gonna shut up. So I'm always pushing this narrative, right? Where, this idea that the Ethiopian eunuch,
Right.
walked his happy self across East Africa to West, got on the boat, Christianized them, and they came across the water with Bibles. It makes no sense, right? There's no evidence to prove that Africans were primarily Christian when they crossed the water. What we do know historically and factually and through documents and through missionary documents and the laws they erected in all of these countries to keep them from practicing their indigenous religions, we know that they were practicing Islam and African traditional religions when they came across the waters.
Yes.
That it was the Anglican Church and later the Protestant Church that began the missionary movement to Christianize them. So when they were Christianizing, going through the process of Christian conversion, that origin, I don't care how much we make the Bible black, that origin, those teachings, those catechisms came from the Anglican, right? Catholic,
Yeah. Yeah.
Protestant, Baptist, Methodist, and so forth. And that's what we have to. And so part of what I get them to start thinking about, the way in which you practice church today, is it built on what you call Black through Augustine, or is it built on what Calvin and Luther and others have said, right? It is a whitewashed Christianity.
Right. Right.
Yep.
And we help to keep that narrative
And
going
we
in
have
our praise and worship.
right.
Right.
Don't
Wow.
don't get me started about that, please.
All right,
'cause
so I'm
there are
quiet. I know
no-
we passed time.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. That's huge. That's huge.
I want to ask you, I mean, I want to just wrap up this section by asking you, what efforts do you have going in DC to erect monuments to the people who actually worked on and built the Capitol? And how can, how can we support that effort? And, if you want to, if there's any place where we could go to do that.
Wait, say that again, because I was reading Reverend Phyllis Coachman's
Right.
question, because
No, what I'm
I
saying-
actually want to tag on what she has offered to what you just said. So
Right,
say
right.
that again.
No, I was asking, like, what efforts do you have? Are there any official efforts? Is there an organization? Is there a movement towards trying to erect monuments that would reflect what your book is asking for? Like, let's get real. Let's keep it, let's have a complete narrative and not a selective narrative. And let's erect monuments to the enslaved people that built the Capitol, at least.
Yeah. So part of me is both and, right? I'm not just stopping at monuments. And when you read the last chapter of my book, I kind of lay out what I'm talking about, right? I'm not talking about a slab of something.
Right, exactly.
I'm not talking about that in terms of monument. I'm talking about something, a permanent fixture.
Right.
And also an ongoing fixture, right? Which means then I'm not talking about something that's fixed, right? And part of me argues that this idea is a part of reparations, right?
Yes.
And I take it from I don't veer from what America loves, because I can want something, but it's not what America loves, right? It'd be nice if we were all engaged in African traditional religions, but we love Jesus. So I'm stepping where you are, right? America loves monuments.
Right.
And because America loves monuments, then let us join America in monument building. And because America's not going to ever take down, no matter how much we want to in the 21st century, get rid of this, they're not going to do it. The European countries pride themselves off of the narrative. And the narrative means, to sustain the narrative, you need something fixed in the city to keep that narrative going. See, what we miss, we spend so much time on this kind of slab of something, and we miss what they're doing. The idea is to keep the story going.
Right.
And you keep the story going by the image. So when Ruby says she comes out of her door and she sees this child in Lincoln, they're reinforcing a narrative. And that's America, right? So I'm saying you need something alongside what America loves, but you also need something else. You need a reparation movement. You need other things. It's not either or, right? I'm not talking Paul. I'm talking about a both and. And so this means then what I'm speaking of is not new. There have been reparations movements. There have been monument movements ongoing. And so I'm a part of a group in DC that is intentional about retelling that story, but there are other groups as well in DC that's doing the work.
Good. Can you, when you get a minute, can you put in the chat, like, what groups, and, like, if you will, or I can send resources later to the people who are here. I want to talk before we end. I really want to talk about the Requiem, because nurturing justice, and in cooperation with and in partnership with Judson Memorial Church in the East Village, West Village, is going to be bringing your work, the Requiem, to New York. And I am so excited on June 15th, for a Saturday matinee performance. So I want you to talk about the Requiem, your experiences doing it, what inspired it. Talk about the Requiem, because I can't wait to see the whole production.
So part of what came about the Requiem after George Floyd, and it was really more Breonna Taylor, because I thought, how do you shoot at a house with somebody you can't see? Like that's even personified. Like,
it is
shooting into something, you don't even know what's in there. Bullets, not one or two. Like, I mean, it's like, okay, corral. Like, it's like, what are you shooting at? So there's something in the psyche that's saying, I must get it, right? Whatever that, and the it is what I'm right? So part of what I started thinking about is some argue that trauma narratives are not useful to us, right? Trauma narratives are not useful to us. Healing narratives are what's useful to us. But part of the reason why I do the work I do is because let me only speak in terms of my research. I tend to believe you can't heal unless you face what's where your pain is. You can't ignore the pain and talk about healing, right?
Right.
And so I take us back through the pain. I take us back through the pain because I believe we got to start naming these white elephants, right? So I take us back through the pain as a form of reparation, right? This, right? And not in terms of what needs to be repaired, but this idea that this pain means then we all need to engage in a process of lament, of ownership. But after you have seen the pain, part of what I try to do in the Requiem is say, we can't go numb.
Right.
Perhaps we should go silent and really think about that pain we just saw, or that we inflicted, or that we felt. Then the healing begins. And when that healing begins, now we have fresh eyes for our activism. And the activism isn't reactionary, it's now informed. Descartes says, I think, therefore I am.
Right.
The philosopher Descartes says, I think, therefore I am. And I love the way the Black religious scholars tell the story in terms of Black people coming across the waters. They add, I think and feel, therefore I am. They felt the weight of the atrocities of a new normal, baptismal waters of a different kind in a new world. And so this idea that I'm saying now we can go back and be more informed about our activism. And so that's the Requiem in 4 parts: to remember, to lament, to reflect, to begin the process of healing, to work through the activism with new eyes. And part of what I say is this is not something that happens in one shot in a 2-hour show.
Right.
But it at least gets us thinking. And I did not know that the bulk of, and this was just something I was doing, to kind of soothe my own pain,
Yes.
what I was seeing. And this has taken flight since, because this was done after George Floyd. And I get more requests for this than I get the book.
Really?
Yeah.
And are you going to be performing it anywhere else besides besides New York on June 15th with us?
No, so it's because I love you, we're doing it, right? Because the cast were like, I can't do this anymore. I don't know how you do this work. Are you crazy? I can't keep doing this work. And so they wanted a break from it.
Right.
And so it's a 4-person cast, and they were just like, I need a break. I can't do it. So when you came to me, I went to them and I explained, and they said no. And then they came back and said, let's do it.
Excellent.
So that's how it's there in New York. We have taken a hiatus. We have not performed since October.
So let's talk about, that concept of, when you're deeply involved, excuse me, in this kind of work. Ruby had asked the question the last time we were all together, how you engage in this work on an ongoing basis, your research, your teaching, your creative work. How do you continue? What strategies do you use for yourself to cleanse yourself of the anger, the pain, the trauma, the ongoing? Because I find it very difficult, but because we do this work, you have to develop strategies to continue to engage in it.
Yeah. So there's 3 things. Well, there's a daily practice. So let me talk about this in a general sense. In a daily practice, there's a daily practice that I work to do because I'm not always good at it, right? But there's a daily practice of meditation I do, which means when I get up in the morning, I touch nothing. I try, no electronics, nothing. and I sit at my altar, and my altar takes into consideration a majority of the traditions that came across those waters. That's what my altar looks like. You have Ifa, you have Vodun, you have, Santeria, you have all these different, you have Christianity, you have Islam. It's all on my altar. I take all of that serious, and I draw from all of those energies to fill me up. And when I finish, just like today, right? I used to go have a drink, but anyway, so lots of drinks.
That too.
Yeah, 2 or 3. But I cleanse myself. I literally sage myself, and I wash myself. But I know that I cannot do this work without them. I'm very clear about that. And so part of this means that I rely on the cloud, and not this, but I do rely on the ancestors to move me through the process. And then, but it's not always easy. So that's a daily process. What I also do, just kind of so that's a daily ritual, but what I also do is engage in conversations with people. I have to get it out. Like you and I, when we had the last sacred power, you called me up and I was like, so I usually have to kind of talk it out. I have to get it out of my system, because the work is hard.
It is really hard. It really is hard. We are so grateful for your work, so grateful that you spent an hour and almost 20 minutes with us. And if I want to just open it up and ask if there are any questions, I'm going to just put it back on gallery view.
And I'll promise to answer quick.
It's okay. I just want to put it back on gallery view and see if there's anybody who has any questions, comments. I'd like to say in our work questions, comments, or threats for Dr. Harrison. She has poured herself out. She's given us a tidbit of her brilliant work, and we are so grateful for you, Dr. Harrison. We really appreciate your time.
And while we're waiting on the question, I just want to say to Reverend Coachman, because when I made the comment about reparations, I get excited when people understand the need to do reparation work, because it's not easy. And it's always this kind of idea that when we're talking about reparations, we're begging for money, right? Like, it's just dumb, right? And so I'm saying that to say the reason why I got passionate when I answered that question, it wasn't in relation to what your question was. It was in relation to kind of keep articulating the broadness of what we mean by reparations, because the work has to take place. It really does.
It does.
Yes.
I see Sister Lydia question.
Hi, God bless you, Dr. Renee Harrison, and thank you for your presentation. I'm not Reverend Phyllis Coachman, but she's in a meeting now. She was here, so it's me here now, and I know that she's extremely passionate about reparations, and I get that, and I think the work that you're doing is very powerful, and monuments are important. But with the Freedmen Project that Reverend Phyllis is a founder of, she's been working so much on reparations and what that means to our people, lineage-based reparations, in the sense that all Black people, as some groups believe all Black people need reparations, but the ones who were formerly enslaved in this country, we're the ones really that America really needs to do that for us. So, and anyway, I wanted you to know that I wasn't being offensive about the monuments. I'm sorry if you took it that way.
Oh, no, not at all.
But I've heard them say that the people who are on the front lines doing this work, especially here in New York, as a matter of fact, they have just chosen a task force. Governor Kathy Hochul signed a reparations bill that they're going to be studying reparations. They just chose a 9-panel task force, a committee who's going to be deciding what to do. So they're very excited about that, the U.S. Freedmen Project, which Phyllis is a part of. They're very excited about that now. So that's probably what they're talking about. But so I just wanted to say that, excuse me, I really in my heart. I didn't mean to be offensive. I wish she was here because she can
That's
explain
funny.
this thing a little better than I can.
No.
But things that happen because we have a lot of things, and people say, "Well, why can't you just be satisfied? You got Juneteenth, you got a holiday, you got Dr. King's Day, you had a black president, and you have this, you have that." And but then all these things are great, but then bottom line is mere symbolism because we're still hurting, like you said, from the times that, you know, the things that we're still dealing with as a result of our people being enslaved in this country. You know, we don't get the credit for, you know, things like the things that Black Hands, White House, you know, that some things we have receipts for, some things we don't. But we have receipts when we hear our grandparents talk about this stuff all the time, about what they went through and how they had to. Huh. I can go on, but
Well, we're going to try to end it up. But you know what?
yeah.
Thank you, Ladi. You know, I
Mm.
mean, slavery was always intended to be perpetual, and it has been. And that's one of the things, you know, there's like, oh, you know, get over it. Which, you know, there's no more slavery now. Yes, there is. You know, the
Mm.
prison labor is currently building the furniture that we're sitting on for 5 cents an hour. I mean, if that's not slavery, I don't know what is. And you can see countless incidents of government officials using prisoners to do things that nobody else will do or wants to do. But
One of the most powerful things, Dr. Renee, you you did in your book, put in your book, was explaining how many socks, how many socks were produced based on the cotton that was picked. I mean, this is how detailed you really
Mm.
are. And that was something because my mother picked cotton. She grew up in Opelika, Alabama. And when I read that, and when I think of reparations, I'm like, if being that attentive to such detail, and I can't remember what that number was, but it was some astronomical number in the high millions that were of cotton picked, and the amount of socks, understanding it in terms we would, because I never, my mother would say, oh yeah, we had to pick X amount of pounds of cotton, fill up. But when you put it in and framed it in something I actually understood, I'm like, yeah, we need something.
Mm.
Something needs to happen because we don't measure it like that because we don't see it that way. We can't see it.
Yeah, I fully agree. And Ladi, I'll say it again. There was no offense whatsoever taken.
Oh, good. Okay.
I just got passionate in my voice because I'm very passionate about the story and the need for reparations, right? So monuments are a form of reparations, but it's not the only answer, right? It's just it's a start. And I'm in awe of how people talk about reparations because I'm still trying to figure out what does that look like on the other end, right? We know that
Right. And they're still
we
figuring it
know that
out.
there
Yeah.
has to be an ownership, right? But on the
Hmm.
other side of that, how does that pay itself out? And I'm not talking monetarily. I'm talking about pay itself out in terms of Black people being compensated for what has happened. And so I'm always, I always am in awe of those that work towards reparations because I'm always waiting to see what that looks like on the other side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's so much work to
Yes.
be done. I mean,
Yeah.
Jackie made a comment in the chat about how much work we still have to do. And I think that it's really important that we continue to find spaces and places to tell the story. And that's why it's important to have you, and your colleagues and others, and we have to tell our own stories. I mean, one of the powerful thing that you said to me tonight was, how are we going to recognize and deal with the elephant in the room with respect to race in America when we're not willing to deal with the elephant in the room with respect to the trauma in our own lives, right? Starts with us as the basic unit, right? And we have to be able to unpack that. And as you talked about that, I thought about a story, because it's easy to get, if you are relatively okay in the world, it's easy to forget all of the macro and microaggressions that you suffered and that you suffered from the time that you were born if you're a person of African descent, right? And so I thought back to a very serious incident that I experienced at Vassar College when I was going. And when I came back from spring break or from winter break, you know, you walk into the dorm and in the main, in all of the dorms, all around campus, Vassar College, 1980 something, you know, the N word suck scrawled across every dorm room. Black
Wow.
women being raped, one a week.
Wow.
It was, you know,
Wow.
those kinds of things. Yeah. And some of my white fellow students were telling me that they were being recruited as Klansmen by the Klan to join the Klan,
Mm.
marched on the Dutchess County Mall every Saturday. And this is in the 80s. So, you know, these are the kinds of triggers and traumas that we do experience. And it's yeah, we have to keep telling the story. You know, we have to, you know, in order to heal. And then we have to find our ways to cleanse ourselves and to, you know, continue so that we can continue on the journey, because this is a marathon. It is not a sprint, right?
Yeah. That's
Yeah,
true.
So
definitely not.
I really appreciate all of you so much for being here. Thank you, Dr. Renee. I want to just give a shameless plug for Nurturing Justice. Please go
Mm.
on our website at www.nurturingjustice.org and donate to keep these kinds of programs going. We've done a lot. We did the spirituality of reproductive justice last Saturday. Today we had Dr. Harrison. On March 21st, we will be meeting with Rob Eshman, who is an author of a book called When the Hood Comes Off, about racism and resistance in the digital space. And so we're going to look at how racism rears its head in digital spaces, and and then we're probably going to do a follow-up to that when talking about how racism shows up in AI. So please
Oh
continue to
boy,
support
and
our work.
AI.
Yeah,
Mm,
continue to
mm.
support our work, continue to come to our program, spread the word. Thank you, Jackie. Did you have a comment, Jackie, before we get off?
I just am, and with my covenant group through my church, we are taking turns talking about the um, the bad girls in the Bible. And well, so as I took my son to urgent care today, and I was sitting and reading through some of the different things, and of course we talk about, you know, so many of the women in the slaves,
No,
that
no, we say
slaves were
enslaved, we say enslaved people.
slave women especially, and it's existed forever. And I'm thinking, why are we still dealing? You know, it was 400 years here, or and more, and we're still dealing with this since forever.
But
And
Jackie, I mean, I want you to hear what, you know, it was 400 years, but it's actually been so much, you know, it's still existing.
longer.
I want to interrupt you and thank you for your willingness to speak, but let's continue this conversation so we can let Dr. Harrison get on her way. She's been with
Okay,
us for an hour and a half.
thank you
Thank
so
you so
much.
much. Um,
You sure you don't want me to answer that question? No, I'm just kidding. No, no,
no,
no. Good.
that's another hour and a
That's
half.
my favorite question. No,
Is it? If you want to answer it,
no,
then
I don't. No, no, no. Because that's a long unpacking,
it
right?
is a long
I used to. I'm just gonna give a little
Yes,
quick
please.
sidebar and say how I say this. When I was teaching history of the Black Church, because people think good, we're gonna learn about the Black Church, but it's trickster. I kind of do something else to open that class. So I had a lot of ethnic groups that would come from different places to take the class because they heard about the class, right? So I have these four. Well, I mean,
Okay,
I have some women that would drive from Gettysburg,
right.
and they would arrive early, and they drive 3 hours just to take my class. And so that question that Jackie raised keep coming up, and by the time they finish the class, they stop asking that question. But I just have to make a joke out of it. They really stopped asking the question because they were like, well, wait a minute, maybe 400 years is 2024. But
Right.
it's it is a loaded question, but it is a question that can be unpacked and help people see. just how what we think was then is now,
Right.
right? And we
Yes.
have to we have to do the work to not see slavery as just chains. And you are relegated to work for someone against your will on a plantation by law and by the Bible, because it's still by law in the Bible by a different name. So it's helping people to see that. They really have to do the work to see it. And I say, you know, you get 16 weeks with me unpacking that, and you realize, oh my God, it probably was worse, you know. So I mean, it's like, you know, and I always laugh at this. I kind of have that. So the other thing you said is I have to laugh. That's how I have to kind of soothe myself through the pain. I have to laugh, but I always say, you know, when Isabel talks about the house, right? You buy a house and you have to. I always I use our own story, right? Something your dad did to you when you were a child against your will, and you 70 something, you still living with that. You didn't say that was then when I was 2 and I've forgotten about it. You still carrying that.
Right.
And you're still waiting on reparations for it.
Right.
We have to deal with the elephants in our homes to see the elephants in society.
Amen. Thank you
That's
so
all I'm saying.
much.
Say
Thank
good night
you.
on that one.
Well said.